noches, good evening. Welcome to the YouTube channel of the Instituto Cervantes, Leeds and Manchester. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Karl McLaughlin for accepting the Cervantes Institute's invitation to give tonight's lecture, which will deal with the work of Catalina Rodriguez de Guzmán, an outstanding literary figure of the Baroque period from Llerena, Extremadura, whose work has remained almost rather unknown to the general public. As we know, the Spanish Golden Age is considered one of the most outstanding periods of Spanish literature. Góngora, Quevedo, Cervantes, but also Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, María Zayas, and the author we present tonight, Catalina Clara Rodriguez de Guzmán, contributed to the development of the literature in all genres, but women were largely excluded from public recognition. For this reason, it is so important, the lectures that Dr. Karl McLaughlin will give tonight, to give an homage to Clara Guzmán de Rodriguez de Guzmán, but also to the women who made great the Golden Age literature of Spain and Europe, the world as a whole, but got not the recognition that they deserved. And now I will present our guest, Dr. Karl McLaughlin. He's a senior lecturer in Spanish at Manchester Metropolitan University. He's also a professional translator and interpreter, working for many years at the diplomatic level in Spain. He has spent much of his academic career researching the life and works of Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán, and has uncovered a wealth of documentary evidence that provides a much more accurate picture of the intriguing writer from Llerena. His work has helped to, for example, has helped the city's authorities of Llerena to rectify incorrect biographical information relating to her official publications. In addition to completing a PhD on Ramírez de Guzmán, he has published a number of articles on her extensive range of surviving poetry, which was not published in her lifetime, but lay undiscovered for centuries in manuscript of the Madrid's Biblioteca Nacional. He has also co-authored a modern edition of her writings, and also Karl is currently exploring the bitter enmity which arose in the mid-1640s between the author's influential family and the Inquisition, which included attempts to see her put on trial for heresy. I hope you will enjoy this conference, and without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Karl McLaughlin. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate. You can put them on our chat, and our guests will answer to them. Thank you, muchas gracias. Y Karl McLaughlin, es tu turno, tu palabra.
Thank you very much, Pedro Acevedo, and thank you to the Instituto Cervantes for the kind invitation to speak on a subject of great research interest to me, and I hope you will find it interesting as well. This talk is part of a very long-standing cooperation between Manchester Metropolitan University and the Instituto Cervantes in Manchester, and it's great to resume that contact after the hiatus that we've suffered over the past couple of years. I've tried to put together a talk with suitable illustrations in an effort to do my best to make it as engaging as possible. There is always a risk with people who have great and keen academic interest in a subject that we forget to make it meaningful to people who don't know as much about the subject. So hopefully I won't get too carried away with my enthusiasm for the subject tonight. And without further ado, let me get started on. So I will be talking to you about Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán, who in my book and in many other people's book is very intriguing, to say the least, and also quite a unique Golden Age writer from Spain. So let me begin with an outline of what I propose to cover this evening. First of all, I'll be giving a general overview of the author and some biographical aspects concerning both her and her family. I'll be looking at some of the proven links that she had with other authors of the day, both in her native Llerena in Extremadura and beyond, and then look at some key aspects of her poetry, including poems that I and others now believe were probably composed for literary academies. And I'll be looking at various categories of those. And as the director has just said, my latest subject of interest is some enmity that arose between the family in Llerena and the Inquisition. I will say more on that later. And at the end, hopefully you will have some questions based on what I will be presenting this evening, and I hope to have time to address them. So first of all, who is Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán? You have there her dates, 1618 to 1685. And for those of us in the field of Golden Age studies, it's become increasingly apparent that she was a very prolific and versatile writer. Now, we know a lot more about authors such as those that Pedro Eusebio mentioned, María de Zayas, Sor Juana, Ana Caramayén, and we know relatively little about Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán, although she is becoming of much increased academic interest over the last few years. We know very little about her because she didn't publish, as far as we know, in her lifetime. And our knowledge of her and her writings is limited essentially to the surviving corpus of approximately 120 poems that are contained in 2 manuscripts in the Biblioteca Nacional in Madrid. But we do know, and I will be mentioning this later, that she wrote not just poetry, but other things also, including a novella and 1 commedia, a play. Those works are now lost, but there are references to them that I will mention later. Now, why was Catalina Clara unusual? She had, many people acknowledge, a very unusual profile for a woman of her day. Firstly, she never married, but neither did she do what many, many women in Spain of the day did if they were not married. They entered a convent as a nun. She spent her whole life, as far as we know, in her home city of Llerena. And one of the key differences between her and other authors of the day is that she had virtually no religious poetry. The bulk of her poetry, as we will see, was witty, burlesque, or satirical. In terms of studies carried out on her, I did my PhD on this author, and I was reminded by somebody just today that it took a long time to complete. It did because I left to enter the professional world and then came back to it many years later. I've also co-authored with Arantxa Borrachero a modern edition of her poetry, and in 2018 there were several articles which appeared coinciding with the 400th anniversary of her birth. That just gives you some sort of overview of what has been written about Catalina Clara. Her poems cover a wide range of meters, both traditional Castilian Spanish meters and the more Italianate forms. And in terms of themes, she covers some of the very philosophical themes of the Baroque, the duality between truth and fiction, the antithesis of life and death. She has some love poetry, poetry on nature, several verse portraits, which we will see in just a moment. Her longest poem is a very important poetic description, a humorous one, of the festivities organized over many days in Llerena in honor of Felipe Próspero, who was the son of Felipe IV, the king. But what sets her apart in particular are the burlesque and satirical pieces, which were very rare for a female author of her time. She does have much more serious poetry also, including some eulogies of aristocrats, one of them being the Duque de San Germán, who commanded the Spanish forces in the war that Spain fought against Portugal which was just beside Llerena in the 1640s. And she's also a great chronicler of family events. Much of her poetry is dedicated to her parents, her brothers and sisters, and recording key family events. I said I would try and illustrate my talk today. This is a copy from one of the manuscripts containing her poem to a friend, Isabel Manuela de Tordoya Salcedo. And the reason why I'm drawing your attention to this poem is that it is the only one in the manuscripts in her own hand. All the other poems have been copied into the manuscripts by compilers. And we know it's in her hands because we had handwriting experts analyze one of the few signatures that we have of Catalina Clara, Ramírez de Guzmán. This is from a document in 1666 when the family estate was divided up amongst the brothers and sisters. And these experts have said that this poem on the left was in her own hand. I've talked a little bit about the who, Catalina Clara. In terms of the where, as I said, Catalina Clara lived, we believe, almost her entire life in Llerena in Extremadura. And it's a very interesting place, far from the center of power, far from the court in Madrid, but nonetheless a thriving provincial town, which became a city in 1642. It had a large ecclesiastical community, many convents, many churches. It also had military importance. Those of you familiar with Spanish literature of the period may recall a reference in Calderon's Alcalde de Zalamea. There's a scene when the troops are waiting the arrival of General Lope from Llerena. Another interesting detail is that one of the most famous painters of the day, Francisco de Zurbarán, lived in Llerena. He moved there from nearby and he married there. And there's a link between him and Catalina Clara's family, because Catalina Clara's father commissioned Zurbarán for some of his earliest works. For example, a fountain on the town square. These are some pictures just to illustrate what a lovely city Llerena is. You've got some of the religious buildings, the main square, the top left. But my interest in Llerena is even deeper. And this is because Llerena was home to one of the first Inquisition tribunals set up in Spain. It was created in 1485 because the religious authorities were concerned at the amount of Judaizing activity by the large converso population in Extremadura. The tribunal in Llerena was very, very influential. Its scope, as you can see here, was massive, covering about 40,000 square kilometers. It was in the papers in the 1970s following the discovery of hundreds of mummified remains in the church, which you can see on the top left. At the time, the international media reported that these were victims of Inquisition executions, but it turned out not to be the case. In terms of Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán's family, I think it's important to begin by saying there is a very illustrious branch beyond her immediate family in Llerena. Her great uncle, who was only 35 years older than her, was Lorenzo Ramírez de Prado, one of the most famous names in 17th century humanism in Spain, and himself an important literary figure. He was on friendly terms with some of the leading authors of the day and is praised by authors such as Lope in their writings. And from evidence in Catalina Clara's poems, we think that he was the primo that she sent poems to for advice. And we say that because in some of the Inquisition documents, witnesses say that the families called each other primos, even though Lorenzo was her great uncle. Her mother, Isabel de Guzmán, well, there's not very much known about her, except what we get through archives and other documents. She was fiercely proud of her lineage, and the archives do contain mentions of disputes between her and, for example, the governor's wife over who should sit where in the church. Her father is a very interesting figure. He held numerous posts, including a regidor perpetuo, so a type of lifelong alderman in Llerena. He went to Madrid frequently in connection with town business. He was an administrator for very influential families, but he was also a very abrasive and outspoken character. That brought him into conflict with many people, including nobles. And there are details in the archives of court battles with some very influential people. The family lived in a very impressive property in the La Puerta Nueva in Llerena, and there are references in poems and in archives to some of the musical celebrations held there, even in the Inquisition files, which I may come back to later. Turning to Catalina Clara herself, I'd just like to mention some key dates and stress the point that relatively little is known about her. We do know that she was born in 1618. That date was initially believed to be 1611. However, it turns out that 1611 was the birth of an elder sister, also called Catalina, who died shortly after birth. And it's interesting to note in the case of this family that 5 of the 11 children did not survive beyond childhood. All 5 of these siblings appear regularly in Catalina Clara's verses, and it appears that she was particularly close to her brother Pedro. In fact, in her last will and testament, we will see, she left everything to him and appointed him to be her sole administrator. Catalina Clara inherited substantial wealth. When the siblings divided up the assets of the entire family passed down through generations, she took receipt of some very impressive properties, vineyards, and several religious paintings of great value. Moving towards the end of her life, we know that she was already in very poor health in 1681, because in that year, she transferred the aforementioned land to her only nephew, Manuel. We have a document from September 1684, which is her last will and testament, which, interestingly, she was unable to sign, and a witness had to sign on her behalf because of ill health. In terms of when exactly she died, that is the subject of some conjecture. Although the last will was drawn up in September 1684, I calculate her death to be possibly mid-1685. And I say that because I've discovered a letter from her brother, Lorenzo, who moved to Guatemala, dated October 1685. He writes to his son, Manuel, the nephew I referred to above, thanking him for informing Lorenzo of his sister's death. And if we calculate how long it took for correspondence to go back and forward across the Atlantic, perhaps mid-1685 is a suitably accurate date. And in Catalina Clara's will, she expresses the wish to be buried in the family crypt in the main church in Llerena. You can see here in the picture. It is a beautiful, beautiful building. So we've talked about who she is, the family, where she lived. Let me move on and talk about her links with other authors. There is substantial evidence to indicate that Llerena was home to a flourishing community of writers, including Lorenzo. One of his poems to a great uncle, excuse me, in Mexico, the Bishop of Michoacán, is included in one of the two manuscripts that I mentioned. We know from other poems that there was some form of literary circle in Llerena. There are references to gatherings to discuss contemporary poetry, including the works of Góngora. And I think there is substantial evidence to suggest that formal academies took place in Llerena. Some of the poems in one of the manuscripts, 3917, prove that she exchanged her poetry with, and she also lent her novella, which was entitled El Extremeño, obvious reasons, to two local authors, Jerónimo de Sola and Juan de Almezquita. But her contacts with other writers didn't end there. From the content of her own poems, we know that she circulated them to female friends also, at their request. And in one of the poems, she actually requests her work back in the form of a poem, a little reminder that they have to be returned. And at the end here, you can see a reference to a title of one poem, which would appear to indicate that she even requested poems from other female writers, even if she didn't know them very well. So those are links with authors in and around Llerena. I was fascinated to discover some years ago that she also had links with authors beyond Llerena, well beyond Llerena. And here we have a screenshot of, this is an actual poem, or what's called a carta. It's a letter in verse form, which was written to her by one Vicente Díaz de Montoya. He was born in Toledo. He was a painter, a calligrapher, and also a poet. But when he was young, he served as a curate in the very cold and, he said, hostile environment of the Sierra de Buitrago, north of Madrid. And from these poems, we understand that he was given Catalina Clara's poetry by a friend, and then he, as was the custom of the day, wrote a poem, a letter in poetic form, requesting more. And this poem is very interesting because it gives evidence that he was aware of the wide range of poetry of Catalina Clara. He calls her an insigne poeta, but he asks her specifically to send him something jocoso, jovial, to, and I quote, alleviate his melancholy in the remote winter surroundings of the Sierra de Buitrago. He then sent another poem on New Year's Eve in response to her reply to his original letter. And I'd been hunting for these poems for many, many years, and I eventually located them in a library in Toledo. And I was struck by the magnificent artwork throughout the 165 folios. In fact, I'm very grateful to Vicente Díaz de Montoya because he begins his poem, if you look here in the first lines, no conocida señora. And I used that as part of the title of my PhD to get across the point that she was not well known, but she was known. I just put up some shots of the second letter in verse form. You can see the magnificent artwork by Díaz de Montoya himself. And you see the title here, Segunda Carta a la misma señora. Still on authors beyond Llerena, details emerged quite recently of another link between Catalina Clara, Ramírez de Guzmán, and a well-known author. It appears that in the mid or early 1650s, Catalina Clara penned a comedia, and this was sent to the Seville author, Fernando de la Torre Farfán, for his opinion. It was sent by a family friend of the Ramírez, Antonio Ijar, who was the Marquis of the Dragón de San Miguel. Farfán wasn't overly impressed by the comedia, and he wrote a rather scathing opinion, which in turn prompted a very sarcastic poem from her in complaint. This exchange of verses, they were discovered by María José Osuna and Inmaculada Osuna, are very important because they helped expand our knowledge of the array of genres of Catalina Clara. It wasn't known until that point that she had written a play. I mentioned academies earlier, and my belief that there was some form of formal literary gathering in Llerena at the time. And I'd just like to say a few words on these academies, if I may. Academies were a massive social and literary phenomenon, the length of breadth of Spain in the 16th and particularly the 17th centuries. Gatherings of the day included poets coming together and reciting poetry on pre-established topics, trying to outdo each other in terms of ingenuity. There is only one published record of an academy for the whole of Extremadura in the 17th century. But I'm convinced that the Ramírez de Guzmán family hosted these cultural events. They were preoccupied with their social status. They regularly entertained distinguished visitors with evenings at home, and poetic gatherings of this type were very much part and parcel of that social interaction. So what I'd like to do is look at some of the evidence, circumstantial and other, that would indicate that Catalina Clara did participate in academies, and as I say, may have even hosted. This evidence begins with some of the trivial content of Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán's verses. Triviality, as Willard King has shown very well, was a characteristic feature of these forums. And the same topics were repeated time and time again in the different academias. What were these subjects? Well, a poem on a woman fainting, for example, or the bloodletting, la sangría, de una dama, of a lady's foot. And these themes appear at various points in Catalina Clara's verses. But the one I love most is the theme of nuns. Nuns and their strange galanes, their suitors, were very popular topics of academic verse, and variations on the theme, such as nuns being courted by cojos, lame men. We have an example here in one academy of un romance jocoso, romance being a ballad, about a dama coja rather than a suitor who was cojo. Ramírez de Guzmán has a number of poems on what might best be described as fickle nuns. And her most famous one is the poetic rebuke to María Gago. And she is, we know, she's a real person. There's evidence in the records of Llerena that she did exist and that she was a nun. And there is a poem in the collection about María Gago and her amorous conquests, including a lame suitor. I think this poem was penned for a certamen, a competition, or an academy type reunion. And I've put up a couple of verses just to show what sort of witty style Catalina Clara engaged in. Cuando dijiste este es cojo, you can see here the pun between I choose this one, es cojo, and este es cojo, he is lame. There are references to the Diablo Cojuelo, very famous literary figure of the day. So again, the signs are that poems were being written for specific gatherings. Still on academies, another piece of evidence. The people who organized these academies, usually poets of repute, would set very complicated rules for the participating poets to follow. Thematic straitjackets, the poems had to address some bizarre or very ludicrous situations with very contrived titles. And if you have studied this period and this phenomenon, you will know that at the end of the Academy, another poet would name and shame those who didn't comply with the rules in the pejanes, the oral satires. Do we have any examples of such contrived titles and bizarre situations? Well, several of Catalina, Clara, Ramírez de Guzmán's titles are very contrived. And in fact, they fit very neatly into what Jeremy Robbins said, the many pieces which have come down to us with no clear indication that they originated in an academy, but whose detailed specificity suggests that they did. I'll just give one example. This is the 59-word title of her poem number 4 in our edited collection. I don't need to go through the title with you, but you can see that it's a rather ludicrous concoction of many different themes. The daughter of a sergeant major who sends her to a convent, promises her that the king will give her the Hábito de Santiago. Anyway, very contrived. It's not a normal topic. It would appear to have been set by an academy organizer, and the poets were tasked with coming up with something witty on the subject. This poem is of great interest in terms of likely proof that Catalina Clara wrote for academy-type gatherings. It's difficult to read. That's the typical handwriting of the day, but it's Soneto a un hombre pequeño. I'm looking at the right-hand page here. And the name of that hombre pequeño, Francisco de Arévalo, is added in another hand in the manuscript. To make it easier, I'll actually put the poem up on the left. It's a sonnet, and it pokes fun at a man because of his small stature. Political correctness in the Golden Age, poetry was not as you would see it today. Tiny men were a popular theme in 17th century verse, including academy settings. I've listed here a couple of examples. Antonio Espinosa, liendre metida en calzones, so a hair knit, wearing breeches. Satires on small women were also popular in academies. There's one by Polo de Medina on a very short woman wearing giant shoes. And these were normally written in sonnet form. Sonnets, one of the most rigid forms of poetry, with a set rhyme scheme, thematic discipline. They were a great test of the poet's ingenuity in an academy setting. Why am I mentioning this particular poem? Well, in the same manuscript, some pages further on, there is another sonnet on exactly the same subject, Francisco de Arévalo and his stature. And that would be a very strong indication that Francisco, or Felicio, as he is called in the poems, was an academy competition. Now, we have to view this very wicked portrayal of him in that context. But also it's important to bear in mind that Arévalo was actually a family friend. He was known to Lorenzo, and he himself was a poet. Another predilection of the period in academy settings were pinturas, or verse portraits. And these very stylized portraits in verse were hugely popular, not just in Spain, but also in England. You're probably familiar with them. The very rigid development of the description of the beautiful lady using stock metaphorical associations. Golden hair, reddish white cheeks that were a blend of snow and roses, ivory teeth, etc., etc. Pinturas regularly featured in academias as a test of poetic wit. The onus was on the poet to produce something original or something witty. And it's striking to note the number of retratos or pintura poems in Ramírez de Guzmán's works. There are 8 of them in all. Some of them, I think, were composed for academias. The observance of the prescribed rules. For example, all these poems tend to have what's called the pastoral charade, the pretense of rural bucolic life, references to the shepherd audience, the bucolic name given to the subject, Antandra in this case, it's Antonia Manuela, her sister, and the use of the term señas, hints, which was part of the whole secrecy game in the academias, as the audience tried to guess who was being described by the author. Of course, parodies of these poems were common in the time, and I've put up some examples in English. Shakespeare, for example, wasn't very complimentary about the breath of his mistress. Sir John Suckling was even more scathing, and his witty send-up of the typical Petrarchan associations is one of the most famous poems of the day. A foot-long nose, not the small, slender nose, pimples, and as you can see, not exactly clean at the end of it. Did Catalina Clara do something like this? Well, she has a number of poems where she derides all these stylized metaphorical associations. I've put up just one example here, where she describes the lady's forehead as más limpia y escombrada que una casa robada, as clean as a burgled house. And then she changes her mind and she says, oh no, I need something more refined, un páramo de flores. She also uses the term retratar. Again, this play on portrait poems, not describing, but actually painting. This poem is of interest for a number of reasons. Firstly, Catalina Clara offers a running commentary on the task of painting, and this has been identified by Jeremy Robbins as one of the typical features of Academy poetry when the author comments on the task in hand. So she's saying things like, digo pues mis señores, so there's a direct address there. She talks about the need for something, un concepto más pulido, and these metatextual references were very characteristic of these poems. But secondly, this extract shows that Catalina Clara was familiar with, for example, Luis de Góngora, because he describes himself as having la frente espaciosa, escombrada y limpia. However, by far the best of the portrait poems is the poem in which Catalina Clara describes herself. I won't put up too many extracts, but suffice to say that the poem is a succession of puns and ambiguous terms of comparison. It's a send-up of the traditional hyperbole used in these conventional verse portraits. And some have compared the standard of these poems with the burlesque portraits of Quevedo. For me, the key point is not just that, but the fact that this may well be the first burlesque self-portrait by a female poet in Spain. Just 2 examples. She describes her nose, not as the elegant small nose that appears in most of portraits, but a horseman. It sits montada sobre su cara. And she hates it. But she says this in a very ambivalent way. She says, siempre la he traído entre los ojos, which is true. Physically, it's between her eyes, but the expression trae entre ojos a alguien is an expression of distaste. Her mouth is not the slender red mouth depicted in these stylized poems. Her mouth attracts attention from everybody. Dicen cuantos la ven, cosa es grande, which would indicate that maybe it's too big. In short, and to finish on this academy context, There are no published records of academies or formal gatherings of this type in Llerena in the 17th century. But, as I've tried to suggest here, firstly, we have evidence of a literary circle. We have analogies with other cities in Spain, and these indicate that these activities did take place. I've also shown that there were demonstrable links with other poets, and that would make her a prime candidate to participate in any gatherings. And lastly, as I've tried to show, there are multiple clues in her poetry which offer reasonable pointers to involvement in such settings. Let me move on to the final area I'd like to look at this evening with you, and that's to do with the Inquisition. But first, I have to say a few words on the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid. It contains, among other priceless, valuable documents, a wealth of materials on the Inquisition. These materials include abundant correspondence between Inquisition officials in the tribunals, the length and breadth of the country, and the Consejo Supremo, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition in Madrid. The materials also include the files on the investigations into people suspected of heresy. They also contain the full dossiers of people who applied for posts in the Inquisition, and they were subject to meticulous vetting. There are also files on internal investigations against officials for misconduct and malpractice. The time I've spent looking at these files has proved invaluable. It's helped me piece together details of, in general, families of 17th century figures, including Catalina, Clara, Ramírez and Guzmán. And I'd just like to take a few moments to show you one or two of these documents and tell you why they're important and what they tell us. Here's the first one. These are very difficult to read, even when you have them close up, because we're not familiar with that style of writing from the 17th century. But this document, and I've put an arrow here to show you, contains a very easily missable reference to Inquisition proceedings involving Catalina, Clara, and Beatriz, her sister. More on that later. It also shows, this is another document, there's a reference here to her father and allegations that he threatened to kill a particular Inquisitor official, Pedro Bracamonte, with good reason, some would say, as we'll see. Now, before I continue, I have to mention one particular post in the Inquisition, the post of familiar. This junior post has a long history. In the early days of the Inquisition, inquisitors such as Torquemada would get together a large entourage for their own protection. And many of these members of the entourage were drawn from the extended family of the inquisitor, hence the name familiar. Down the centuries, that role changed, and rather than just accompanying the inquisitor on his travels throughout the country and protecting, they gradually became something a bit more. They were what's been called the eyes and ears of the Inquisition, particularly in rural areas, rural provinces. Instead of being drawn from the lower echelons, shopkeepers, tradesmen, etc., they were increasingly drawn from the ranks of local elites. And designation or appointment as a familiar brought multiple privileges and benefits. As you can see here, a list. Exemption from tax, exemption from ordinary justice, and of course the visibility that comes with holding such a post, including the right to place a stone plaque over the doorway of your home. In case it's of interest, I came across this, which is a certificate of appointment as a familiar dated Llerena, 1636. And this manuscript was sold quite recently in 2017 on internet. Now, back to our family. Catalina Clara's two brothers, Pedro and Lorenzo, applied to be appointed familiares in 1642. Now, given the family's standing, its influence, this should have been a foregone conclusion. But much to my surprise, when the initial inquiries were made, the investigating members of the tribunal reported to Madrid that there was conflicting information on their background. In other words, had they got skeletons in the cupboard? Meaning, was the Jewish blood? Because of that, Madrid ordered officials to go to Llerena for more detailed checks. And those checks lasted nearly 4 years. Of interest to me is the fact that the process has shown quite clearly that such vetting was used to damage reputations, to settle scores. In short, it was a free-for-all. And the inquisitor that I mentioned, that Catalina Clara's father threatened to kill, Pedro Bracamonte, was later charged with fabricating records to incriminate the family. Francisco was targeted by his enemies. They looked upon the vetting process as a chance to get even with him for things that he had done to them, perhaps by not approving planning permission, etc., when he was an official. There were a number of serious allegations made. Several witnesses during the vetting interviews told the inquisitors that comments had been made about the family years ago. They were called judíos por los cuatro costados, Jews through and through. And it was common knowledge. Hasta los niños lo sabían. And bear in mind that that allegation was the most serious that could be made against a person or their family. Remember the importance of the limpieza de sangre in Spain at the time, the purity of blood. A second allegation was that one of the senior officials of the Inquisition in Llerena, Juan de Leaño, was actively supporting the application because he was secretly married to Catalina Clara's sister and hadn't obtained the required permission from his superiors in Madrid. The allegation went that he was aware that she was infecta, i.e. of stained blood, dubious origins, and therefore didn't dare request marriage license. This allegation led to a very protracted investigation, and everybody who was said to have witnessed the ceremony or knew something about it was interviewed. The priest actually said in his statement that the allegation arose because enemies had something against both Juan de Leaño and Francisco Ramírez. Among other allegations, Catalina Clara and her sisters were accused of crimes against the faith, and one of the tribunal members, Cristóbal Serrano, complained to his superiors in Madrid that his own colleagues were acting improperly in fabricating evidence that they were guilty of these crimes. By way of anecdote, at the very end, there's a reference to a detailed allegation that Francisco and his allegados, his immediate circle, had full control of the postal service, and they were privy to all the correspondence between the tribunal in Llerena and the Inquisition Council. The procedure was very lengthy, very costly. It was geographically wide. Witnesses were interviewed as far apart as Madrid, Salamanca, and Seville. It was very costly because the family had to pay for that vetting. And we have several documents in which Francisco Ramírez requests an extension to the deadlines for payment of the inquisitor officials' fees. The surprise in all this is that it was inconclusive. There is no record of their appointment as familiares. And if they had been appointed, the two brothers, they would certainly have mentioned it in later documents. They didn't. Interestingly also, both of them departed Llerena soon after. Pedro remained in Spain and became a very senior official. Lorenzo emigrated to the New World. He was involved romantically with a family servant who became pregnant, and the family found a husband for the servant from a nearby village, and the son, Manuel, the only member of the next generation, was entrusted to the care of a local priest, Juan de Castillo. I'd like to end with a poem by Catalina Clara in which the Inquisition is mentioned. And I think this poem draws together her characteristic witty, burlesque style. It's about an Inquisition official who was visiting Llerena, but he was accompanied by a secretary who was not exactly to the liking of the ladies of the time. This witty jibe at the tiresome secretary, I think, encapsulates Catalina Clara's style. You can see at the end the joke, which is characteristic of the decima format in satirical and burlesque style. The joke comes at the end, and here the joke is a pun. Que escriba, so the advice to the inquisitor is que escriba con secretario y que visite sin él. Use a writing desk to write, but don't bring your secretary on your visits. That's the evidence of the Inquisition in the poems. I think the Inquisition's appearance in the family is a very controversial subject. It's the one that's giving me a lot of research interest of late, and I hope to produce some findings in the near future. So, Pedro Eusebio, Instituto Cervantes, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about my research on Catalina Clara. And I think there are some messages in the chat box which I can't read just yet, but if you would like to open a turno de preguntas, I would be quite happy to take some. Thank you.
Thank you, Karl. It was a fantastic lecture. Yes, we have three questions in the chat. First, Pat Blenkan asked, was Catalina's mother related to Conde Duque de Olivares?
Not that I know of, and she, Isabel de Guzmán, would have certainly mentioned this in some of the documents that I have obtained. She makes reference to her lineage, and Olivares doesn't appear in it. Some other famous names of dukes do, but I don't know of any connection there.
Then Carlos Fulquillo, this is from Instituto Cervantes, says, recently information about Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán has been updated on a statue in the town of Llerena thanks to your research. Can you tell us more about it?
I think I should begin with the... Me alegro que me hagas esa pregunta, Carlos. This is a very interesting story. Llerena, for years, has had a statue. If we can go back to the first slide, I don't know whether I can put it back up again or not, but I'll tell you the story anyway. For years, they had a statue of Catalina Clara Ramírez de Guzmán with an extract from one of her poems underneath, and gave her years as 1618 to 1654 in her own town. And over the years, I have built up some documentation to try and persuade the town authorities that that is wrong. Eventually, after many years of trying, they did set up a comisión permanente, etc., to look at the change. It's not easy to change official monument information in Spain. And they set up a committee, they approved it, and not that long ago, they erected another plaque which actually gives her correct dates. And I was invited along at the time to present my evidence, because it had to be put in an expediente to give to the mayor in Llerena, and they acted on it. And I was very pleased to see that they have changed the date. So if I don't do anything else in this world of research, I can say that at least I've had some impact in remedying a wrong and adding 30 years to Catalina Clara's official lifespan in Llerena.
And then we have another question from Luis Castelvi. Is there any proto-feminist content in Ramírez Guzmán's poetry? And he also asks, has her poetry been translated into English?
Yes, thank you, Luis, for that excellent question. I haven't actually gone down that path in my talk, but it is the elephant in the room of anybody who studies Catalina Clara, looks in particular at the feminist, proto-feminist content. In fact, there are those who interpret much of the love poetry that she writes as indications of lesbianism. And it's something that we need to be very careful of, because as I have said in some publications, if we take today's Facebook or WhatsApp messages between females and we look at them in 300, 400 years' time, we might say the same thing. Things like, love you, you're beautiful, etc. And nobody would say that about those contacts. And yet, people have interpreted some of the poetry of Catalina Clara as denoting lesbianism. We have no evidence for it, but there is considerable feminist content, and the portrait poems that I mentioned, Luis, are held up as the example of the rebellion against the stylized metaphorical associations. She does things differently to protest at that sort of content. In terms of translations into English of her poetry, the entire works have not been translated. That's a asignatura pendiente. But in some of the articles that have been produced by scholars, particularly in the United States, they have provided some translations. And in some English translations of Sapphic verse, there are translations of Catalina Clara's poetry. But as a block of 120 poems, no, they have not been translated.
Thank you very much. There are no more questions on the chat. I would like to ask you, you are working now on this accusation of heresy from the Inquisition. And how were it, because from what you explained in the lecture, there was, this process was open, it was not conclusive this heresy of, you know, or you might guess, what were the grounds for this accusations of the Inquisition? Because they were from a very wealthy family and very prestigious. Maybe there was just an economic aim to take the property of the family for another people related to the Inquisition.
That's very interesting perspective. I hadn't thought of that. The Inquisition sometimes did confiscate properties. If you were accused of heresy, put on trial, the auto de fe, or sometimes you would have property confiscated, or assets confiscated. This wasn't so much the case here. It was more a case of tarnishing the name of the family to settle scores and prevent the brothers from getting the posts as familiares. Although there were references to Catalina Clara and her sister being given a rap on the knuckles by the Inquisition for apparently invoking non-Catholic deities, these are the sort of accusation. But they never stood trial. There was nothing beyond attempts to show that the family had San Benitos, that they had hidden skeletons in the cupboard. Part of these Inquisition inquiries meant that the officials had to go through all the parish records and Inquisition records back at least a century to see, did anybody in the family tree of the Ramírez de Guzmán have a San Benito? In other words, had they been identified as committing crimes against the faith? It was more on that line, I think, to damage the family. But the financial aspect you mentioned, Pedro, is very important, because bear in mind that these costly procedures were revenue for the Inquisition. So the longer you dragged something out,
Yes.
the more revenue you brought. And I wonder, did the family just pull out because it was costing too much, even though they were wealthy?
Thank you very much. And there's a comment from Paul Hogue. It says, fascinating talk, thank you. I hope a bilingual edition of her complete works will be published soon. We hope so also.
Is that an offer from Paul to look after it? If so, I will certainly help.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. It has been a very fascinating lecture, and we will keep cooperating, Karl, with the Instituto Cervantes now with the times are better for the face-to-face activities in Instituto Cervantes. And thank you very much. Muchas gracias to our audience for being with us tonight, and I hope you have enjoyed. Thank you.